Awesome, guys. Welcome back. I'm here with Srini, the host of the Unmistakable Creative podcast, where he's interviewed over 1,000 people, including Olympic gold medalists, billionaires, bank robber, various authors and icons, presidential candidates, and even a porn star or two. So definitely going to have some interesting chat here. He's also a Wall Street Journal best-selling author. 3 times, The Art of Being Unmistakable, Unmistakable While Only is Better Than Best, and An Audience of One, Reclaiming Creativity for Its Own Sake. And he even had a little cameo on Netflix's Indian Matchmaking. So, it's awesome. We're glad to have him here. And yeah, I guess just start off, you can introduce yourself and then just kind of let us know like one of the things, I know you're here to talk about creativity and crisis, but would love to hear about how you've dealt with the big crisis in your life and the best way that you found to deal with those things.
Yeah, so I think that as far as introduction goes, we kind of covered a good amount of it. As you mentioned, I'm the author of multiple books. I host the Unmistakable Creative podcast and do a bunch of other things. But I think that when people ask me what do, I usually just say I use the internet to make things. And some of those things are absolutely stupid, because we live together, so you've been witness to my insane ideas on a pretty regular basis, and some of them are never going to see the light of day or never meant even for public consumption. But I think that creativity in crisis is particularly near and dear to my heart because I think my creative career began out of a crisis. I basically finished business school in April 2009, which was a terrible time to get out of any kind of school because you had a combination of this massive recession and another thing where we went from being in an economy that had for decades rewarded people for fitting in to almost overnight being in one that rewarded people for standing out. And so suddenly the sort of track that you follow as an MBA, which is go get your degree, apply to the jobs, and find yourself a nice cushy job making 90 to 100 grand a year as a middle manager, that more or less vanished. It was just no longer an option. And so I found myself, back at my parents' house, living there, I think it was probably 30 years old, and nobody thinks that, hey, I'm going to be living with my parents when I'm 30. Like, you think that's it. When you're 18, you're done and you're never going back. So needless to say, it was a pretty rough time, and it was, I mean, for everybody, it was a crisis. Now, I looked at it as something that, and I keep in mind, it's easy to say all of this in retrospect. Of course, I wallowed in my misery and complained. I mean, even the day of my graduation from business school, I was like, this is more like my funeral than my graduation. In fact, I think my actual funeral will be a more joyful occasion. But the thing is, it was a rough time. It was really rough to have spent all this time and money getting this degree that you thought would open doors, and instead you basically have, watched the world blow up and your career blow up in your life. So what I had, I think, was the gift of time, which is something that, any crisis pretty much gives us, particularly the one we're in now. And so I realized for the first time in my life, I've got this huge stretch of time. I can either sit here wallowing in my misery, which I did, keep in mind, for about, a week or two, drinking vodka. And needless to say, Indian parents don't have any tolerance for a 30-year-old drunk at their house. So that was the end of that. And so basically I borrowed $500 from my dad to enroll in an online course about starting a blog. And I poured all of my energy into that. And that sort of was the foundation for where I've ended up today. And the funny thing is that I didn't start the blog to build a business. I had no intention of necessarily building, what I have. Somebody asked me the other day, they're like, what is it that made you think that you had something so important to say that you were worth listening to? I said, I didn't think I had anything important to say that was worth listening to. I just had this desire to express my creativity, and my sort of natural tendency, as you know from, living together, is when I see new technology, it's like, oh, what could I make using this? And so that's really kind of defined my career. And, as a byproduct, needless to say, that ship of, starting that first blog, which I only started to help me stand on the job market, really sailed off course, and led to, the Unmistakable Creative podcast, writing books, and all sorts of things that I could not have planned for. One of my favorite Seth Godin quotes is like, the best way to be where you want to be a year from now or 10 years from now is to do something today that you'll be glad that you did. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of like planting seeds. You just don't know when they're going to bear fruit. But the thing is that it takes time for any seed to bear fruit. If you're even thinking about planting things in a garden, right? It takes, what, 6, 7 weeks? Well, you can't, get to 7 weeks from now and think, oh, why don't I have any fruits? It's because of what you did 7 weeks ago that you actually will get the fruit. And so that's kind of the way that I think about this. That's kind of a jump off point.
Nice. Yeah, kind of makes me wonder if it steered you off course or on course. It's like
Yeah,
we never know.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. I think that one of the things that happens is that crisis, in a lot of ways, is a reckoning of sorts. It's a moment to kind of look at your life and say, okay, how comfortable have I been, and how much of where I'm at right now is out of the genuine desire to do what I want to do, or out of my desire for comfort. And human beings by nature just can't stand discomfort. Susan David, who's an emotional researcher and psychologist, actually says that discomfort is the price of admission for a meaningful life. And everything you do when you've never done it before is comfortable. Crisis in particular is incredibly uncomfortable in numerous ways. But yeah, I think to your point, we can see it as a disaster, or we can see it as an opportunity. And don't be wrong, I don't want to downplay the severity of crisis. People are really suffering, and I think it would be irresponsible for them to be like, oh, just be creative and forget about the fact that you have bills to pay and all this kind of stuff. So I just want to put that out there.
Cool. Yeah, that makes total sense. So you talked about how these big crises has really helped define you, and they're a great time to kind of take a step back and sort of reevaluate. How do you think you've reevaluated during the past 4 or 5 months now that we've been in this crisis?
Well, I think that the thing that I saw, and keep in mind, one of my biggest sort of income streams was vanished because I was a public speaker. That was a huge part of it. And I think that what it did was it gave me an opportunity to say, okay, look, what parts of my life and my business are highly dependent on variables that are out of my control, and which ones are in my control. And that really kind of fueled basically focusing on all the things we can control. So we built an online membership site where we help people make their ideas happen. And what started out as sort of just a way to build community and to try to spread the word about Unmistakable Creative evolved. And I think when we started this thing back in October, we first monetized in December. We opened it up to 11 people. We're making about $100 a month on the site, and now it generates $1,100 to $1,200 a month in recurring revenue because of the fact that we were able to shift our energy to the thing that we can control. And I think that I think if you look at crisis, right, it happens in sort of 5 or so stages, which is kind of like the 5 stages of grief, right? So you have panic, you have projection, you have acceptance. Then, from acceptance, you get awareness, and from there you get action. But a lot of people get stuck in those first 2 phases of panic and projections. You panic about something, and then you make it mean all of these things, and you basically, predict the future. And because of the way that you're thinking about the future, you more or less bring about the worst version of the future, because all of your actions are fueled by that. Now, one of the things that we as humans have a unique capacity for is this ability to pause between stimulus and response. And I think that that's a big thing, to kind of say, okay, let me not panic, or let me not act on panic. And, because what happens is that if you panic, you don't take that pause, in projection, your actions actually become the very thing that basically brings about the worst case scenario that you're projecting. So I think it's important to really kind of take time, and to me, unplugging is a very critical part of this. We live and that's really hard right now in a 24-hour news cycle where, you're just being bombarded with not just news, but everywhere. And the thing is, our primary connection to the world happens to be the internet at the moment. Right. And yet, I still think that you need windows of solitude, time away from sort of work. We don't play nearly enough. I think this is a really important part of the creative process. As you know, we torture you with our endless games of NBA 2K21, other right now. But the truth is that I find that to be an invaluable part of the day. It's actually incredibly important because it actually, re-energizes me. Even when I lose, I mean, I get mad when I lose, but still it's fun. And I think that that's one of those things that we kind of lose sight of, is that this is supposed to be fun. Even in the creative process, there's a point at which you start to make this shift where it does start to become about the joy of the work. And something really interesting happens. All the external results start to come after that. But yeah, I mean, I think that really what this is about is it's largely a process of self-discovery and self-awareness to figure this out. So Justine Musk, who's a friend of ours and the former guest on Unmistakable Creative, who happens to be Elon Musk's ex-wife, one of the things she said is that crisis shatters all of the structures in our lives. And it could be an identity crisis, it could be an economic crisis, it could be personal crisis, whatever it is. We have heartbreak, we have all these things that we have to basically deal with. But when those structures get shattered, we can either try to rebuild them as they were, or we can build something that's new and 1,000 times better. So you go back to the example of me not having a job post-business school. Now, I had a lot of classmates who sat around lamenting the fact they didn't have a job. And then many of them did what I think was the height of stupidity. There was one girl who literally applied to every job on the internet. And said, why would you do that? It's just a bad use of your time. But I think there was a delusion that, I'm going to rebuild the structure that was once in place, not even thinking about the fact, well, that structure is never coming back. Anybody who saw that crisis knows that it wasn't like all the jobs that were lost during that crisis came back. What we realized in that moment was 90% of those jobs were irrelevant. We didn't need them. And that, requires reimagining what the structures of your life are going to be when you rebuild. And so I think that's critically important to understand if you really want to make good use of the crisis, because there's no point getting back to the status quo after a crisis, because the status quo was what put you in that crisis in the first place.
Right. Yeah, that's so interesting, because I think right now, you talked about how things are changing and things that have gotten eliminated. And I mean, you're seeing a massive increase in, virtual events like this one, people connecting on, over the internet. How do you think we can utilize the tools that we have today to increase connection and creativity without detracting from it, especially in a time like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that, this is something we have to think about, right? The funny thing is, it doesn't matter what a tool is. There are a number of different uses for any tool. You can use a hammer to build a shelf, or you can use a hammer to hit somebody over the head and kill them. So it's really thinking about this in a very deliberate and mindful way in terms of how we utilize the technology that is at our disposal. So I think that, if you look at it, you can use a tool like Facebook to mildly entertain yourself, or even Twitter, whatever it is, and watch the hours go by as you scroll through Instagram and read through your newsfeed or whatever it is. But the funny thing is, you can use those same tools to share creative work, to do creative work. So I think that the first thing that it comes down to is a very mindful and deliberate approach to how you use technology. And I'm saying this as somebody who's the ultimate junkie when it comes to exploring new tools, to the point where I drive people around crazy. But I think that Cal Newport had a really great way of looking at this in his book, Deep Work, where you take a craftsman approach to tool selection. You're kind of saying, okay, well, here's my goal. Does this tool support the goal? So as you know, I'm hardly ever on Facebook. I just happened to be during this brief window where this Indian matchmaking thing came out, only because I wanted to connect with old friends. But the thing that you have to look at and say is, okay, let's say, for example, your goal is to write, 3 really in-depth pieces. Does the tool actually support the goal? If this is, what is the tool? What's the goal? What are the highest value activities that lead to the goal? So let's say just use writing as an example, or as a blogger for me. For me, it's okay, I want to do 3 or 4 really in-depth pieces that go deep into a topic. Now, does Facebook necessarily support that goal? Maybe not as much as you would think. So I could live without it. Whereas something like Notion, which is kind of my go-to for everything, is essential. That is something that I actually can't live without, because it actually elevates my ability to do my work.
Yeah.
I think that when you look at tools, so like I said, my default question always is, what can I make using this? And the funny thing is that you have tools at your fingertips that are easier to use than they've ever been. The ability to go from idea to execution is something that we've never seen at such a pace. Now, I'm saying that with one caveat. Just because you can go from idea to execution at such a rapid pace, you're also not going to experience success with that idea as quickly. That still takes all of those things that nobody wants to do, which is the 10,000 hours of mastery, because you're trying to stand out in a sea of noise, and at the end of the day, what stands out in a sea of noise and what rises to the top is stuff that's of high quality. To sum it up, you can't hide shitty art behind great marketing. It's just not possible. Even if you manage to get some degree of success with that, eventually it'll be revealed for what it is. So that's the ugly part. But there's one other question I think is incredibly valuable for people to ask when you think about sort of fueling creativity. And I can't take credit for this, but Julian Smith, who's the founder of a startup called Breather, which is Airbnb for office space, now is an investor, written a couple of New York Times bestselling books, also had probably what was one of the most popular blogs on the internet when he was an active blogger. One of the things he said to me that's always stayed with me that has driven a lot of my approach to this is when he sees something happen in the market, he's, what does this make possible that wasn't before? And the thing that happens is every 3 to 5, sometimes 7 years, and that cycle is getting shorter and shorter, you have these fundamental paradigm shifts that change what's possible with technology. So for Julian, he gave me this example of, okay, in 2008, Apple comes out with the iPhone. Shortly after that, you get location tracking as a part of the iPhone. And suddenly, billions of dollars in innovation that weren't possible before become possible. I mean, many of the startups we take for granted, DoorDash, Airbnb, Uber, all that stuff was born out of the intersection of those three technologies. And if you go back to, say, the late 90s, when e-commerce first came about, the adult film industry figured out how to take our credit cards over the internet and charge a payment. Mark Andreessen created the web browser. So you get the combination of a commercial web browser plus the ability to transact, and suddenly e-commerce as we know it is born.
Right.
And fast forward to today, you're basically seeing the intersection of all of these technologies at once, which is making unparalleled amounts of creativity and innovation possible at a level that we've never been able to do. Somebody like me who doesn't know a damn thing about writing code and finds computer science just to be overwhelming and difficult, I can build apps. Like, they're literally no-code app building tools that you see rolling through product hunt every single day. Thanks to artificial intelligence, the things that we can do now are things that would have taken hours take minutes. And just to give you an example, our other roommate Matt wanted me to film a trailer for him, a speaking trailer. Now keep in mind, I'm not a video expert or videographer. I understood how to tell stories, but just by using the software that's available, what would normally take thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours, we could do in a matter of a day or two. And really make it surprisingly good with very little effort. And I think that that's the thing we gotta understand. So, as far as making sure it doesn't become detrimental to our efforts, that's a whole other landmine in which we really have to kind of think about ethics, like the way we control or consume information. And I think part of this is about being deliberate about what you consume in a lot of ways, because the danger, particularly in the ecosystems that people like you and I live in, is that we end up in an echo chamber where we're seeing the same types of things, reading the same types of books, and basically falling victim to our own cognitive biases that just, confirm everything we already believe. So I think it's important to seek out viewpoints that you disagree with, to expose yourself to a wide variety of people, ideas, information, because otherwise you end up with a situation similar to the one we're in now, which is just we're divided, we're polarized, and you can't get out of a situation that's polarized unless you're willing to have meaningful dialogue with people that you don't agree with.
Right.
Well, you and I don't agree on a lot of things, but we live together.
Right.
And if we weren't willing to do that, we'd be at each other's throats. It would never work. And I think that that's fundamentally important. The other final piece of this that I think I'll layer on top of this in terms of the communication piece and connection piece is that one of the problems with the way that we use technology is that we tend not to recognize that just because somebody is, behind an avatar, behind an Instagram feed, whatever it is, that doesn't change the fact that they're a human being. And I think for me it was just based on the recent Netflix experience where, at the end of the day, I came out looking pretty good, and the other person whose name we won't mention came out looking worse. But I made a deliberate point never to engage in any way, shape, way, or form to say anything bad. Because I saw what was happening. It was so bad that I was like, why am I going to contribute to somebody else's suffering? Yeah, they might have said something awful about me or wrong about me or done wrong by me in some way, but what do you gain from that? And I remember just recently I published this article on 10 lessons from Hindu mythology that can guide us today. And one of them was about choosing your words. It's easier than ever to troll, celebrities on social media, criticize people you've never met, and judge people's lives or their choices based on the perception that's created via the avatar that they show to the world. And it's a wildly inaccurate avatar. So I think that those are sort of layers. So there's, sort of the tactical layers, but I think there's also the human layer. We have to remember that behind all of this are human beings, regardless of, who they are, or how they come across. Really, this is the way I say it. You can use the internet as a platform for inspiration or outrage. What do you think is going to lead you to a better life?
Right. Yeah, you talked about sort of, how people see you online. And I think it's an interesting concept that I wanted to ask you about, even like with your brand Unmistakable, the word unmistakable and almost everything you do, and looking at people that stand out. It seems like there's, I noticed from speaking to you, there's a big difference between sort of how you define yourself and how, versus letting others define you. Right. So what would you say is like the way that people can show up to these kinds of conversations, with that knowledge, with like, I'm trying to reach out and have a breadth of experiences, but I'm me in that.
Yeah. So one of the things we have to understand is that, when you're in the public eye, media is this incredibly powerful tool to shape perception. And any public figure is hyper aware of that. And you have to be if you're going to be a public figure of any kind. We like this idea of, complete authenticity, but that's not feasible. I say things to you that I would never in a million years say in a public setting. The three of us together, you, me, and my roommate, do. All of us would basically be in lawsuits and PR crises pretty much all week long, from the way we start our days to the way we end them. And the thing is that, and it's not that we're horrible people, but the thing is that people have to understand that being authentic and being yourself when you're in a public position of any kind, or a public figure of any kind, doesn't mean you just shoot from the hip. You have to be mindful of the fact that every single thing that you do, say, tweet, Facebook, whatever it is always shaping the perception of who you are. That's just how media works. You can say one thing, and I'll give you an example without the specifics, but I was on a podcast once, and I was with my friend Elizabeth D'Alto. She asked me some question, and I answered it, and I didn't really think about the answer. And when I was talking to my business partner and a content strategist, they're like, we know you well enough to know that there's no way it came across that polished. They're like, you have the recording of this, right? And we're like, yes. They're like, play it. They're like, yeah, this is a crisis in the making. This sounds sexist, misogynistic, and I'm anything but those things, but just one sentence. So I had to actually go back to her and say, look, I cannot have you air this because your audience overlaps with mine. It comes across really awful. And the thing is that you got to remember also, in the public eye, you're not just representing yourself. Everything you say and do is also a representation of every single person who is associated with you or who has invested in you in any capacity, whether it's your audience, whether it's your community. Then in my case, it's editors, speaking agents, investors, a whole group of people. So I think that there's actually a really fascinating book by a guy named Stephen Goldstein called The Turn On, which is, he said, how powerful people from Washington to Wall Street to Hollywood make us like them. And I'm actually going to be interviewing him soon. But I think that book really is probably the best explanation I have ever found about the psychological component of what it means to be a public figure and build an audience for you.
Wow. Awesome. Yeah, I know, we've talked about both, sort of our external environment, whether it's related to media or like the crisis that we're facing. How do you kind of regulate your internal environment to show up how you do, with the big audience, with, all of the crises going on right now that all have their own little flashpoints? What does that look like for you internally?
Yeah, the funny thing is, I think so much of the funny thing is, there's maybe no area of life, where, unlike environments, where external problems can solve internal problems. Now, what I'm not saying is, go out and buy a bunch of shit you don't need and make yourself feel better. But environment has a profound influence on human behavior, emotions, and everything else, right? And I'm not talking about, like I said, mansions and Ferraris, but we had this guy, Jim Bunch, who talked about this concept of the 9 environments that make up your life. And you have a video on our website. You can find it on YouTube. If you just do 9 environments, Jim Bunch, Unmistakable, you'll find it as an animation. But the idea is that everything in your life is an environment, and they're inextricably linked, from everything you eat to what you wear, to the people you surround yourself with, to the content you consume. And that is one of the few places where we have the power to choose external inputs that actually influence our internal well-being. So, I'm fortunate in that I live with you and Matt. That takes care of my social environment, so that if anything else bad happens, it kind of serves as a buffer. Now, in a crisis or a pandemic, that's probably really hard for a lot of people, especially people who live alone. But it's amazing how small aesthetic changes to your environment can make a huge difference. So, if you look at my office, there's a reason I have, frame prints of the people I've interviewed on my wall, because it inspires me. I'll give you another tactical example from my book and an experience that I had. So, end of 2014, I was in a really bad place. My business was kind of on life support. I had a really rough year, and I was back at my parents' house, not thinking I would be. And I remember looking at the bookshelf, and I was like, okay, I want to clear this bookshelf of anything that no longer inspires me. It's almost like taking a Marie Kondo approach to your bookshelf. And so there's a reason the book is called The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, because there's something very magical about eliminating things that no longer represent who you are or what you want, because what you do is you create space for who you want to become. And so I would say, don't design an environment for who you are, but design an environment that's conducive to the person you become. So I got rid of every book I ever owned about social media marketing, because I don't care about any of this stuff. And the top shelf was basically nothing but books published by Penguin. It was just a strange coincidence. 2 weeks later, I got an email from an editor at Penguin asking if I wanted to write a book with them. And so after that, I was sold. I was always like, okay, environment matters. And, like I said, it from clutter to every little thing. But ultimately, really, the litmus test is very simple. When you go into any environment, whether that's the media you consume, or being on a summit like this, or the people that you surround yourself with, even the clothes that you wear, this is actually a really simple one, because right now, you of all people know, because you saw how I dressed for the entire first month we lived together, I basically looked like a homeless person, because I wore this flannel from Costco every day. And that flannel is awesome and warm, by the way. You should all get one. But that being said, there's something that happens when we're working from home. You don't have to actually get ready or do anything. And just for anybody who's a woman, this. Think about how you feel about yourself and how you carry yourself when you put on a really, really nice dress to go to like a black tie event. You carry yourself differently. You think about yourself differently. And so even the simple act of getting ready for work can fundamentally change how you feel throughout the day. So, I think those are small sort of physical tweaks that help manage your internal environment. Now, obviously, there are all the other things that I'm not really the expert in, with meditation, exercise, but I think that if you look at it all as a sort of interdependent system, that all impacts each other, everything is related. So, the people that you're with will influence how you feel about yourself. The clothes that you wear will influence how you carry yourself. All of that ties together. And all of that basically is really kind of, for me, been the foundation of managing sort of the emotional ups and downs. And it's not that I'm immune to ever being down or depressed.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, well, I really appreciate the time here, and we're about to have to wrap up here. But before we do, just can you, where can people find out more about you? Where can we connect with?
You can find the Unmistakable Creative podcast anywhere podcasts are available. Amazon now has podcasts, apparently. I don't know if ours is there yet, but Spotify, iTunes, or whatever podcast app you listen to. And then unmistakablecreative.com is where you can find out more about what we do. And then all my books are on Amazon.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for stuff. It was great insight, and such a powerful new piece of this conversation that we're having throughout the summit. So really appreciate you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Awesome.